In February 1959, 9 experienced Soviet mountaineers died on a slope in the northern Ural Mountains. Their tent had been cut open from the inside. Their bodies were found scattered across the snow, some without shoes, some without adequate clothing, in temperatures of -25 degrees Celsius. 4 of them had severe chest or skull injuries, including multiple fractured ribs and a major skull fracture, with no external wounds to explain them. One woman was found beside a stream, her tongue, her eyes, and part of her lips missing. There were traces of radiation on some of the clothing. The Soviet investigation closed in 1959 with a conclusion so vague it became its own mystery. The group had died as a result of a compelling natural force. For 60 years, no one could agree on what that force was. People proposed avalanches, military weapons testing, infrasound-induced panic, UFOs, and Yeti attacks. The case became one of the most debated, unexplained events of the 20th century. Then, in 2021, 2 scientists ran the numbers. What they found was not a conspiracy. It was physics. I came across this while looking into forensic science and cold weather survival. The Dyatlov case kept appearing, not in paranormal forums, but in engineering journals and snow mechanics papers. That was the signal, so I went deeper. To understand why the science matters, you have to understand why the case resisted explanation for so long. The Dyatlov group were not beginners. Igor Dyatlov was 23 and had led multiple expeditions through the Ural Mountains. The 9 hikers were experienced skiers and mountaineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. They set out in late January 1959 on a Grade 3 hike, the highest difficulty classification in Soviet mountaineering. When they failed to send a telegram confirming their return on February 12th, a search party was dispatched. They found the tent on February 26th on a slope of a mountain the indigenous Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, roughly translating as Death Mountain. The tent had been sliced open from the inside. Footprints led away from it downhill toward a forest roughly 1.5 kilometers away. The prints showed that people had left barefoot or in socks. The first 5 bodies were found in or near the forest, clustered around the remnants of a fire. They had died of hypothermia. Their clothing was inadequate for the temperature, and some were wearing items belonging to others, suggesting frantic redistribution of whatever could be found. 2 of the bodies showed burns on their hands and feet, indicating they had been close to a fire while still alive. The last 4 bodies were found weeks later under 4 meters of snow in a ravine. 3 of them had massive internal chest injuries. Lyudmila Dubinina had 6 fractured ribs on the left side, 4 on the right. Semyon Zolotaryov had 5 fractured ribs on the right side. A 4th had a severe skull fracture. The force required to produce these injuries, without corresponding external wounds, was exceptional. Dubinina was also missing her tongue. The tissue loss has a plausible forensic explanation. Her body was found in a stream, under meters of snow, and prolonged post-mortem exposure to water and scavengers is consistent with this kind of loss. One plausible explanation for the radiation traces involves Yuri Krivonyshenko, one of the hikers, who had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility near Kishtim, the site of a serious nuclear accident in 1957. Contamination from previous exposure may have transferred to other items of clothing in the extreme cold. This has not been definitively confirmed, but it is a mundane explanation for a detail that once seemed sinister. What remained genuinely unexplained was the internal trauma and the question of why 9 experienced mountaineers had abandoned their tent in the middle of a Soviet winter night and fled down a mountain without adequate clothing. Here's the strange part. One obvious explanation was always an avalanche. A wall of snow hits the tent, the group panics, they flee, but the physical evidence kept undermining it. The slope angle where the tent was pitched was approximately 23 degrees, below the slope angles commonly associated with slab avalanche release. Search teams found no evidence of significant snow displacement around the tent, no avalanche debris, no classic avalanche scar on the slope above. The bodies were not found in the aftermath of a large, obvious avalanche. They were scattered over a wide area, some close to the tent, some kilometers away in the forest and ravine. This distribution pattern didn't match what a typical avalanche produces. For 60 years, investigators and researchers who looked at the slope angle, the lack of evidence, and the injury pattern concluded it couldn't have been an avalanche, or if it was a very unusual one. This is what made the mystery persist. The most logical explanation appeared to be physically inconsistent with the evidence. Now set the mystery aside for a moment. In early October 2019, a journalist from the New York Times called Johann Gaume, the head of the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. Gaume was an expert in snow mechanics, the physics of how snow accumulates, behaves under stress, and fails. The journalist wanted his opinion on Dyatlov. Gaume had never heard of it. He spent the next several weeks reading everything he could find. The more he read, the more he believed the case was solvable, not through speculation, but through physics. He contacted Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer at ETH Zurich, and they began modeling the slope. What they found was that the usual avalanche scenario was missing a crucial piece of the physics. The question wasn't whether a massive, obvious avalanche had occurred. The physical evidence didn't support that scenario. The question was whether a small, localized slab avalanche was physically possible under the specific conditions of that night. They built a computational simulation. Johann Gaume of the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at EPFL in Lausanne and Alexander Puzrin of the Institute for Geotechnical Engineering at ETH Zurich published their findings in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment on January 28, 2021, exactly 62 years after the group set out from the abandoned North 2 mining settlement. The paper identified 4 factors that, in combination, could have produced a delayed snow slab release directly above the tent. The group had cut into the slope to pitch the tent on a flat surface. This slope cut created an irregular geometry in the snow layer above. That night, strong katabatic winds, cold air flowing rapidly downslope from higher elevations, deposited additional snow onto the area above the cut. The weight accumulated slowly, over hours. At some point, a crack formed and propagated through the slab. A block of snow, not a massive avalanche, but enough released and fell directly onto the tent. Gaume and Puzrin's simulations showed that this slab, hitting people lying on skis in their sleeping bags, would have produced injuries consistent with those found in the autopsies, severe internal trauma to the chest and ribs from compression between the snow above and the hard ski surface below, with no external wounds. The delay between the tent cut and the slab release, modeled at between 7 and 14 hours, meant the group had likely been asleep when it happened. They woke to an impact in the dark at -25 degrees, with some of their group already injured. They cut the tent open from the inside. The model suggests the collapsed snow may have made the entrance unusable. They fled downhill in the dark, in shock, with no time to dress. The hikers with severe injuries may have ended up in the ravine, while others appear to have tried to make it back toward the tent and died of hypothermia in the attempt. Gaume and Puzrin's paper is not the final word. Science rarely produces final words when physical evidence is limited. A 2020 report from Russia's Prosecutor General's office concluded that an avalanche was the most likely cause, though some researchers noted that specific wind conditions in the model could not be independently verified. A 2022 follow-up published in Communications, Earth and Environment by Johann Gaume of EPFL and Alexander Puzrin of ETH Zurich reported findings from 3 subsequent expeditions. A January 2022 expedition found fresh slab avalanche evidence less than 3 kilometers from the original tent location, providing evidence that such events can occur at Dyatlov Pass under the right conditions. Some remaining details have plausible explanations. The soft tissue loss is consistent with prolonged exposure in the ravine. The radiation traces have plausible links to previous nuclear work, but neither proves what happened that night. The important distinction is between evidence that supports a mechanism and evidence that proves a historical event beyond doubt. In this case, the first exists, the second does not. The 2021 paper made the injury mechanism and the group's flight from the tent highly plausible. What it left open was the exact sequence of events that night. 9 experienced mountaineers, a slope cut for a tent, katabatic winds depositing snow through the night, a slab that released hours later in the dark. It is not a dramatic explanation. It requires only the ordinary lethal mechanics of snow on a slope. The Soviet investigator who closed the case in 1959 wrote, "Compelling natural force because he had no better answer." He was right about the category, if not the mechanism. The force that killed 9 people on Kholat Syakhl was entirely natural. It just took 60 years and a simulation lab in Switzerland to show how it could have happened.